Welcome to episode 73 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's episode 73, we'll read approximately Latin lines 614 through 704 from Book 5. We'll be talking about the rising and setting of the sun and similar astronomical issues. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Nor can one certain reason be assigned why the sun declines from its summer height and bends his winter course towards the tropic of Capricorn, and then returning, reaches the tropic of Cancer and makes summer solstice, and that the moon in every month finishes the same course through the 12 signs, as the sun takes up a whole year in running through. I say one certain reason cannot be assigned for these events, or perhaps the cause may be what the venerable opinion of that great man Democritus has laid down, that the nearer the stars are to the earth, they are carried more slowly about by the general motion of the heavens. For the rapid force and celerity of the upper sky are much lessened before they reach the inferior orbs, and therefore the sun, with the lower signs that follow it, is in some measure left, because it is much lower than the high region of the stars. And the moon is much lower still, and the greater distance from the heavens she observes in her course, and the nearer she approaches the earth, the less is she capable of keeping pace with the motions of the sign, and the slower she is in her motion than the sun as she moves below him. And the signs may the more easily overtake her and pass about and beyond her the oftener. And therefore the moon seems the sooner to run through all the signs, when in reality the signs return to her. Or perhaps 2 several airs may at certain seasons blow from the opposite parts of the world by turns. The one may drive the sun down from the summer signs into his winter course and the extremity of cold. The other may raise it from the cold winter signs into the summer solstice. And for the same reason, the moon and the stars, which fulfill their periods and revolutions in their long courses, may be forced upwards and downwards in the heavens by 2 several streams of air likewise. Don't you observe the clouds driven by contrary winds with different ways, the lower opposite to those above? What then should hinder that the stars should not be carried on by contrary blasts of air through the great circles of the sky? And the night, we imagine, covers the earth with thick darkness, either because the sun in his long course has reached the extremity of the heavens, and being tired has blown out his fire, scattered by the swiftness of his motion, and decayed by the tract of air he passed through, or the same force that raised his orb and drove it round above compels him to change his course and roll beneath the earth. And Matuta, the goddess of the morning, at a fixed time leads aurora blushing through the regions of the sky and opens the day, either because the sun, returning from under the earth, attempts to enlighten the world with his rays before he appears himself, or because the seas of fire that were dispersed abroad in his journey the day before flow together in the eastern sky and illustrate the earth with a faint light, before they have kindled up anew the globe of the sun. This, they say, is easily discovered from the top of Mount Ida, where, upon the rising of the sun, we first discover his scattered rays, which are afterward contracted into one orb and make up one ball of light. Nor are you to wonder that these seeds of fire should flow together constantly every day and repair the splendor of the sun. For we observe many things in nature that act regularly and at a fixed time. The trees look green at a certain season, and at a certain season cast their leaves. Children at a certain time shed their teeth, and the boy grows ripe at a certain time, and shows the soft down upon his cheeks. And lastly, the thunder, the snow, the rains, the clouds, the winds are no less certain, and fall out in fixed seasons of the year. For the course which things observed from the beginning of the world, they pursue the same, and continue still to act in the same certain order. The days likewise increase, and the nights grow shorter, and the nights increase, and the days shorten, either because the sun, in his course above and below the earth, moves obliquely in unequal lines, and divides the heavens into unequal parts, and what he takes off from one part of the heavens he adds so much to the opposite part again, till he arrives at that sign in the heavens where he cuts the equinoctial line and makes equal day and night, for this line is equally distant from the 2 tropics, which are the bounds of the sun's motions towards the north and south. And this is owing to the obliquity of the zodiac through which the sun finishes his annual revolution and shines upon the earth and the heavens with an oblique light. Such is the opinion of those who have marked out all the regions of the heavens and adorned them with 12 constellations. Or because at certain seasons of the year, the seeds of light which repair the decayed splendor of the sun flow together sooner or later, and so occasion his rising in different parts of the heavens. The moon may shine with rays borrowed from the sun and appear to us every day with greater light, as she retires further from the sun's orb, till being directly opposite to him, she shines out with full beams and climbing up the earth, views him from above, setting in the west, and then goes backwards, as it were, and hides her light gradually as she passes through the different signs in her nearer approaches to the sun. Thus they explain her phases, who conclude her round like a ball, and that she moves below the sun, and they seem to be right in their opinion, and speak the truth. But the moon possibly may steer her course by her own light, and show different phases and forms of brightness, for another body may move below her, and attending to all her motions, may interpose and hinder her light from being seen. But this body, being thick and dark, cannot be discovered by the eye, and perhaps the moon may roll around her axis like a ball, whose one half only is bright. This ball, as it moves around its center, will express the different appearances of light, till it turns the whole bright side to us, and shines full upon the open eye, and then by degrees it turns backward, and takes away its bright side as it rolls, and we see no more of it. This was the doctrine of the Chaldeans, who followed the hypothesis of Berosus, and attempted to overthrow the vulgar astrology of the Greeks, as if the schemes of both could not be true, or you had less reason to embrace the one than the other.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that. If anybody was confused that the Epicureans like to talk about alternative explanations, they should have no further concern about that after reading a passage like this. So where would we like to dig in? It's sort of similar to the material we discussed last week, and some of the lessons we'll draw from it are probably similar, but the more we read into it, it's beginning, at least in my own mind, to sort of gel more about this picture of our world being a more limited area than the universe itself, obviously.
One thing I did want to bring up, and it's literally just came to me a few minutes before we started today, that I wanted to go back to last week's section and talk about the differences in translations between the wary philosopher and then the other one's translating as going step by step. That bothered me, and I didn't really have a chance to look into it until today. And so if you will
Absolutely. When we noted that last week, that was interesting, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to go into it then. So definitely, what did you find when you looked into it?
Well, it was interesting. I went back, and of course, I went back to the Latin, and the word that Lucretius uses is peditemptim, and I looked it up, and it literally means by stretching out the feet, because it's pede is from feet and temptin is from stretch, and so there's two separate definitions that Lewis and Short give in the Standard Dictionary, and one is step by step and slowly, and the other one is by degrees or gradually or cautiously. And that literal meaning of stretching out the feet step by step, the image that instantly came to mind was crossing a frozen pond, that like you put your one foot out and you test the ground and see if that works, and if that does, then you put your next step out and you just try it again. So I get the impression that they're talking about, and the thing that bothered me with the word wary was that whenever I think of somebody being wary, they're like, looking for danger, or they're being cautious for just cautiousness sake, and it just didn't seem quite right. And so this idea of moving along step by step, and you test, in a figurative sense, you test the veracity of one theory. It's like, okay, well that part makes sense. Let's go on to the next part of that one, see if that makes sense. And so that idea of going step by step or by degrees, that you're cautiously testing the things that come along, made more sense to me than just being cautious and looking for danger and being suspicious and that sort of thing.
We were talking this week about DeWitt's tendency to go further and embellish things than he might. I think you're right. It sounds like to me that word is clearly related to steps, and the way you're moving forward for the ice situation really seems like a good analogy to me. But I guess a word like that could end up taking its own life and becoming a synonym for cautiously or warily, you think?
And that's what it looks like from what I could figure out from looking at Lewis and Short. Was it was originally a sort of a literal thing where you're going step by step, going slowly. I saw a reference to elephants, that they were, it was used in reference to elephants because they go, sort of step by step and check their steps and that sort of thing, sort of go to slower pace sometimes. And then it took on the figurative definition of going by degrees or gradually or cautiously, which makes perfect sense. But I think that, having those two definitions in mind is sort of a, because like I said, whenever they just said, the wary philosopher wouldn't do this, what exactly does that mean? I think wary has sort of a different connotation in English. Then, it may be an allowable synonym for the Latin term, but I think it takes on a different shade of meaning in the English whenever you read it. And I think that, if you're going gradually and step by step and cautiously and that sort of thing. But like I said, the analogy of the frozen pond was the one that just instantly came to mind. And whenever the literal definition of the two words that are put together are by stretching out the feet, that's just what I thought of. It's like, okay.
I think that's a great tangent that we went back to catch that, because I totally agree with everything you're saying. I guess is the technical word for that idiom?
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, I think that's the word idiom, and I'd love to just be able to throw out another example of a word that turns into an idiom, but I don't think I can come up with one. But what you just said makes perfect sense to me, that it would be easy to stylize, or I guess stylize is the right word. You stylize an idea of somebody walking carefully across a hazardous area, and then that becomes an idiom for just everything that you're doing cautiously. So I
thought it was interesting that the whole phrase and the word that comes after the one that means step by step or cautiously is progredientis, which does mean advancing or proceeding or progressing. So you are moving along and you are moving step by step, but you're taking each step cautiously. So it's not like you're standing in one place and you're looking for danger coming at you. You are progressing or advancing, and you're going step by step, but you're being cautious as to what you accept and all that sort of thing.
That's a hugely important point too. And as you say that, I'm going to forget, is it the end of book 1 where he uses the analogy of proceeding step by step, the light of each step eliminating the next? I kind of connect that in my mind with what you're talking about right now. I believe that's the very end of book 1. That's almost the conclusion of it, where he talks about, if you know these things that we've discussed in this first book, then you'll be able to step by step proceed to learn the rest.
There you go.
So
there you go.
I didn't look and see what word was used at that end of book 1, but it would not be surprising if it was a similar word to what you're talking about. If life were just longer and I had more time, I would have definitely jumped back to check the Latin on that, or I would do it right now, but time is short. Okay, so that's great. That's a great observation. What's the next observation for perhaps this first passage of our several paragraphs today? So Democritus apparently was one of their reference points. I see that he had the same view of the stars and everything in the sky moving around at relatively close proximity to the Earth. Don, you're probably thinking about what I'm about to say. That reminds me of a discussion also we had this week, and I don't think Martin weighed in on it. But Martin, going back to the issue of the size of the sun, Martin, when you think back to last week and having read what you read today, would you say that the sun is the size it appears to be? Would that formulation allow for the sun to be larger than the Earth? And of course, the sort of premise of that question is that you know that the mountain ranges at a distance are huge, and you know that the sun looks pretty large as it sets behind the mountain ranges, so it seems to be larger than that. Using that as one example, do you think it's possible that Epicurus thought that the sun was actually larger than the Earth?
In principle, yes. The thing is that he definitely stated that the normal proportionality between distance and the size it makes on our eye, that one is not valid for active light sources. So I mean, this is it's in some way wrong, but as I explained last time, there are exceptions from this proportionality, which are caused by diffraction, and probably he was not aware of that. So he was going more for this explanation about that light sources don't change as much in size in proportion to as we are distant from it. Like a fire from a distance still appears then, is then visible, even though a non-active light source would not be visible. But based on that one, it can still be argued that the sun is just the size of the basketball. And so that is a thing that it's not clear enough. He might have thought that it's big, and he just wanted to affirm. I mean, because he goes by the senses, and he sees no reason why the sun should not be the size as it appears to be. But then what does it mean as it appears to be? So because it's vague enough, so it can, it's not excluded it's larger than us, but it's also not excluded that he actually meant that it's just the size of a basketball.
Right. There's no doubt that there's lack of ability to be really sure what he thought. But I guess what I'm trying to do in my own mind, at least, and when I talk about explaining things like this to other people, you often run into contentions that Epicurus certainly thought that the sun was relatively small in size, maybe a basketball. I'm not comfortable saying that that is a fair characterization. I don't think it's certain that he thought it was no bigger than a basketball. So that's what I'm trying to kind of improve my own formulation of the way I would describe it. Don and Nate also this past week on the forum were talking back and forth about that. And Nate was throwing out some good examples, if I recall, about when Epicurus or anybody else would see the sun setting behind the mountains and appearing pretty large as it goes behind the mountains. And of course, the mountains are huge. So how could it be otherwise that the suns were bigger than the mountains would be one way of arguing it. Don, anything new to add to that?
No, I definitely agree with what you're saying too, because Epicurus wasn't an idiot. I mean, he knew that the mountains were huge and that the moon and the sun set behind them. So they had, I really like the way that you've been trying to bring up, as big as it appears can mean any number of different things.
And so, therefore, you should not jump to the conclusion that it means something that would indicate that he's an idiot.
Exactly. Yeah. To put it bluntly, yeah.
You don't have to necessarily be Norman DeWitt or somebody who wants to put the best possible gloss on everything. You can certainly admit that there were some observations that were not as accurate or well thought through as we might prefer. But you don't have to jump to the conclusion that makes him just look absolutely the worst possible light every time.
Exactly. So, that's almost like a stoic thing to do. So
that's something that somebody not sympathetic to Epicurus, and it seems like I see that a lot. And there just doesn't seem to be any reason in my mind, to take a negative viewpoint like that.
That's definitely a situation where I can see, multiple plausible explanations, in the Epicurean sense that we've been talking about here. So it's by picking one, you're just like, maybe not.
Yeah.
The one which is in favor of the basketball size thing that Lucretius and probably then also the books from Epicurus he read for the poem went in quite some detail to try to explain why a rather small sun can emit so much light. And
right.
If the sun was greater than Earth, this would not be an issue. Then if the sun was greater than Earth, it would be trivial to expect that if this whole big object is on fire, that it can light the whole atmosphere around Earth.
Right.
That's a very good point, because in the stuff that we read last week, he talks about the sun isn't necessarily just a one object, that he used the analogy of a fountain of light coming out of it and spreading out over the whole world and stuff. So it could be that it's small, but it's a source of a lot of energy coming out of it, like a fountain of water or a fountain of light, is the case in the sun.
We probably end up jumping around too much to say what I'm about to say, but isn't that one of the things discussed today, that he was also saying that it's not possible to exclude the possibility that the sun extinguishes itself at the end of each day? Is that in today?
Right. In the second paragraph, I think that was in the second paragraph. Let me try to find it.
Yes, being tired has blown out his fire.
I find it interesting that he's using those kinds of metaphors whenever he went into so much detail of saying that the celestial objects did not have their own animus or were not living beings. And then he starts using metaphors like, it's tired. And that's another thing I would have to go back and maybe look at the original Latin too, just to see if he's actually sort of giving those objects agency, or whether it's the translator giving them a sense of being, tired and taking on human qualities.
Right. Because in that same paragraph, he's talking about them kindling up anew the globe of the sun.
And there is he talks in here about, the globes and the balls. And so, we are talking about spheres and not, flat disk things. So I did think it was interesting in the section about the moon that he actually goes so far as to say they seem to be right in their opinion and speak the truth. It's like, oh my heavens, you're going to pick one over the other.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, or it could be this, or it could be that. So it's still hedging his bets. But that line really jumped out at me. I'm like, oh my heavens, you're making a decision on one of them that you think has more veracity than the other ones.
I guess there's always that tension between saying something is certain versus saying something is more probable.
There you go.
Even though it certainly sounds like I use the word certainly myself too much. In fact, it seems like sometimes every time I use the word certain, I immediately realize I should not be using the word certain because it's not certain at all. But nevertheless, here he seems to be taking the position that as long as you don't say it's certain, you could still say that something may be more probable than another.
There you go. Exactly. Statistically speaking, this is more possible than this one. Yeah. But I'm going to stretch my feet out and test the waters on that one. And then we'll go on.
Well, before we go too far, I'm still sort of in the second of our paragraphs today. One of the things that I see at the end of that second paragraph that I think about when I compare it to the letter to Herodotus is the very last sentence of that paragraph where it talks about, for the course things observed from the beginning of the world, they pursue the same and continue still to act in the same certain order. So I'm just highlighting that as another reflection of that position that even though we have the swerve and the potential for the atoms themselves to change direction and do things at no fixed time and no fixed place, we still see lots of things that go on in a ordered, regular, repetitive motion, which he's describing from the period from the beginning of the world, as opposed to the beginning of the universe, which would not have a beginning, frankly.
Yeah, that section caught my eye too, and I think it's interesting because at least in my mind, it goes back to the idea that the atoms tried every possible permutation and they finally settled on this particular one, and this particular order of things worked. And that's why we see them repeat over and over again, because that's the one that finally sort of brought order to this corner of the universe. And this is just the way things happen to be because this is the way things happen to be. Was Martin trying to find a section that he wanted to talk about? I can't remember now.
I think Cassius found it already. He mentioned it. But I myself did no more search for it.
Yeah, we were talking about the possibility that the sun extinguishes itself and then kindles itself anew, and that is the opening of the second paragraph there.
One thing I did find interesting in reading this, all of the possibilities that he gives are more or wildly less correct than how things actually go. But it still surprises me in the level of observation that he brings up, and that he's able to give all these different possibilities just from the sheer idea of his observations. The one that sort of struck me specifically was talking about that in the morning you can see the whole horizon is red and then the sun sort of rises out of that. And that's, it's just one of those things that you would sort of look at and just sort of notice and not, really give it any thought. But the idea that you noticed the phenomenon, you came up with an idea, and here's where it came from, and then here's another possibility. But just all these tiny little details that he finds. The talk about that children lose their teeth, and then boys will finally get their beards, and all this, just all these tiny little details that come out. And I'm assuming that these are from Epicurus's volumes of On Nature, because that's the thing that he is using. But it's hard to separate out between what observations Epicurus had made and what observations Lucretius had made and how they all came together. But the fact that there are so many detailed observations of physical phenomena and nature and that sort of thing just always strikes me.
When you say that, Don, what that reminds me of is the issue that some people will talk about at times in terms of, it looks like they had a good solid collection of observation. People want to say that Aristotle is the first scientist, or that he was much more scientific or something than some of the other guys were. But obviously the Epicureans too had a good collection of information and were working on information. They weren't just speculating on things without observation. But none of these guys really made the transition into more of an applied science type of thing, like, for example, Martin does. He takes his science and he's got a laboratory and ultimately a factory to produce things. I don't know that we've really ever discussed it before, but there's this issue floating out there in the minds of at least some people about why the ancients never moved forward from their observational studies into more applied science. Why didn't they come up with steam engines? And that's a terrible example because I guess they did have a steam engine. Why didn't they come up with electricity? Maybe they even had some electricity too. But why didn't they come up with the different things of modern technology that we have today? What's the difference between our approach that makes us focus on these technological issues as opposed to the ancient mind, which doesn't seem to have been interested in that, or as interested as we are in that? Mark, I bet you've heard that kind of discussion before. Just to throw it back at you first, do you have any comment on that kind of question?
Yeah, I mean, for us it's easier because we have elaborated scientific theories which are proven. So, and at that time there was much less certainties in the models, like here, what he presented here, all kinds of different models, and then it's much more difficult to come up with things. But actually, I mean, the ancient Greeks and Romans did come up with things. So they certainly knew how to apply the theorem of Pythagoras. They knew how to use the liver laws and in a very ingenious way. So they knew a number of these more simple things which we can grasp intuitively. But what we have with a more complex technology, that one requires both a more solid scientific base and existing technology. With the type of iron they produced in ancient times, I don't think they would have been able to produce a vessel which could have hold enough pressure that you can make a workable steam engine. I mean, they had a predecessor of the steam engine, but that one didn't hold much pressure. So it would release the pressure immediately. And with that old type of iron, if I had tried it, I think it would have blown apart. It would have been a bomb, basically. It had sealed it and heated it up and bring the steam out to produce the steam, it would have exploded. And they also were not able to make these safety valves, which were then fitted to when the steam engines were built in several hundred years ago. So all kinds of things was not yet in place to do that. Huh? Or let's take James Watt as an example. So he is credited often shortly with inventing the steam engine, but actually he improved it dramatically. And so he didn't start from scratch. There were existing engines, but he was a university technician, and he was taking care of one of these old machines. Huh? And then he by working with them, he then got the ideas where he can do critical improvements, which made then the steam engine much more useful for a lot more than just pumping water out of the coal mines.
That is an excellent point. I never thought of the whole idea of a steam engine having to have a pressure vessel and safety valves. I mean, everybody goes back to the steam engine, quote unquote steam engine, that they used to open the doors of the temple when they lit the fire and that sort of thing. And I'm like, well, yeah, they were right there. They could have done it, but you're absolutely right. They didn't have the technology to do the pressure that needed to actually, drive a train or something like that, or the safety valves to let up the pressure. I never thought of it that way before, but you're absolutely right. They had the rudiments of the theory and a practical application to open the doors when you lit the fire on the altar, but they just did not have the ability to do that in a industrial sort of way. Thank you. That really sort of opened my eyes for that.
I don't want to take too much time if we need it for discussing other special sections of the text here today, but this is kind of in my mind a continuation of what we were talking about a little bit last week on the question of, well, Epicureans are just content just to come up with a couple of explanations and then they're just going to stop and they're not going to just push the issue further. At least that's the allegation of some people who are kind of negative towards Epicurean philosophy. And that's, in my mind, that relates to this in sort of the same way that we can observe that the Epicureans were interested in all sorts of science. I mean, the study of nature is what Epicurus says that he invested himself in for the most of his happiness, and obviously spent much of his life investigating and systematizing and recording his observations about nature and coming up with conclusions based from them. And yet it's probably valid to say that there seems to be, or it's natural to ask the question of why that approach did not lead more immediately in his own time to some of the technology or advances that we found were made centuries later when the Industrial Revolution and things began to take place. Was there something about the attitude or something else about what was going on at the time of the Industrial Revolution that would distinguish why that took off when Epicurean study of nature did not lead eventually in the same direction? Or at least it did not in their time. And really what it comes down to is I'm trying to anticipate critical questioning that might be asked of someone who is looking at all this material and saying, well, there's a whole lot of science in Lucretius, but it certainly didn't lead him to come up with an iPhone or something like that. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts on the philosophical way to distinguish that.
Again, about enabling technology. So for the industrialization to take off, the steam engine, as improved by James Watt, was the enabling technology. And it was what we call now disruptive technology.
Yeah, the one thing that keeps coming to my mind, unfortunately, is that a lot of technology is used as either to scale up production or to be a labor-saving device. And both the Greeks and the Romans and most all of the ancient world had a large enslaved population of people. They didn't have to worry about labor saving because they had people to do it, and they didn't have to worry about it. So it's like as long as it got done, there was no reason to scale it up or save labor because they had an inordinate amount of labor that they just exploited.
That's the first thing that comes to my mind, too, is one of the things that people will throw out there. I'd be interested to know, Martin, what do you think about that? Don and I are both Americans coming from the same background. What do you think about that?
I mean, there's certainly a point of it. I mean, it's not only like this. So, for example, we have also, I don't remember who exactly it was, but it's again in this context of the Athenians almost abolishing slavery. So that, and also I think it was maybe in Lucretius even. So somewhere I read that the slave owner should not just treat slaves as doing the boring slave job, but rather that they learn something and grow also. So that means there was already an idea that life should not be too boring with repetitive manual labor for the slave. So that means there was some motivation also to improve things with being more efficient. In doing this. And we see this partly with mechanical devices. So if you have slaves who can just take, say, a big spoon to scoop up the water and put it in a bucket, then you don't need to invent an Archimedean screw to pump water. But it was invented in ancient Greeks and also in other countries, similar devices. So that is one thing. So it would not have completely stopped people from inventing things. And the other observation, which is more in favor of that point, is what I observed when I had an American visitor here in Thailand. So then he observed that at a construction site, a construction worker was using a hand saw to cut a fairly big piece of wood. And this is something what in US or Germany wouldn't happen, because the time this takes would make this cut extremely expensive. So instead, the construction site has a disc saw. You go to the disc saw within less than a minute, that wood is cut.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a good.
Yeah.
The other thing that came to mind was that we don't really know what we don't know. I mean, we have, take for example the Antikythera device for the astronomical observations. We have Archimedes' screw that we know of, and there could be any number of things that were lost that we just do not have remains of, and so we just assume that they didn't have them. But who's to say there weren't other labor-saving devices or inventions that were out there that are just buried in rubble somewhere, or were made out of wood, or were made out of some perishable material, or there are papyruses that had plans for things that we don't have anymore. There's so much that we don't know. I think that we tend to think that we know so much about the ancient world, and we know almost an infinitesimal amount of what actually life was like back then, even with all that we do know.
Yeah, that's a good observation too. The topic almost smacks to me almost of a kind of a Marxist analysis or something. It strikes me as just far too easy to look at something like the institution of slavery, or just to look at something that's sort of a social organization method and say that that explains why the technology did not advance, or that explains that there's no need to live in a nice house, because if you've got a slave, you don't need to live in a nice house, or whatever. There's so many things that having somebody to do it for you is not the complete answer to, whether it's avoiding disease or just better food or whatever. You may have a slave or somebody at your elbow to carry out your wish, but it doesn't take a lot of brilliance to realize that that's probably not all that life is about. And so it's always struck me that there must be at least a combination of factors, if not just something totally different, that would explain some of the different attitudes that apparently existed between the ancient world and the more modern world. To try to keep this sort of related, again, it's all a matter of that Lucretius is largely a science book. It's the study of nature, and you are constantly sort of wrestling with the fact that, are you simply studying nature solely so you can get out from under the fear of gods, and once you're out from the fear of gods, you can just put it back on the shelf and not worrying about it any further? I don't think that could have been really the Epicurean attitude. That would be unfair to the people who had it to just, that's that same attitude of running from pain. As soon as you finish running from pain and get away from the immediate heat of the fire, that's all that you want in life, is to escape pain. I think that's probably not the way everybody looks at it. Maybe some people do, but I don't think that's the way Epicurus would have looked at it either.
Yeah, I keep coming back to that with the whole idea of pain and pleasure, that you're willing to put up with immediate pain.
Yes.
That going to lead to more pleasure. So it's not always about running away from pain. And I agree that there are some who try to characterize the philosophy that way, but it's in the documents we even have left, the few documents that we have left, it's about the long-term planning of your life to live as most pleasurably as possible, and you will put up with some pains now to get more pleasure in the future and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's not just removal of pain. It's not that.
Yeah, you're about to get me wound up again, because that would be the argument I would see some people make, is that, Lucretius and Epicurus, they put all this effort into studying nature, and they did all these observations about atoms and void and came up with all these theories and so forth. But in the end, all they wanted to do was to blow up the idea of a supernatural God, and thinking that they were under the thumb of religion. And as soon as they achieved that goal of blowing up supernatural religion, they just went back to their cave and started eating their wine and cheese and figs and put everything else aside, because that's just the way that people who pursue pleasure are. They're not very driven. They're not very interested in life. They're just interested in avoiding pain. So that's
7 volumes and just on nature. So
yeah, it's
that's
not
a lot to put in for.
If you want to avoid pain, there's a lot easier ways than putting all that work into composing all those volumes you're talking about.
Exactly.
Is there anything else in the material from today that we should cover? These last 2 paragraphs, in fact, we haven't really discussed very much, but I'm not sure that I see the oblique nature of the zodiac or things like that being particularly helpful to us, because he's in the end continuously showing that these are just alternate explanations. The very last sentence might be of interest. I don't really know the significance of this, when he talks about the doctrine of the Chaldeans, who followed the hypothesis of Berosus and attempted to overthrow the vulgar astrology of the Greeks. I don't know what he's talking about there in terms of the Chaldean astrology being supposedly superior to the vulgar astrology of the Greeks. Do you guys know what's referenced there?
Are the Chaldeans the same as the Babylonians? They had
I thought so, but maybe wrong.
So I guess the Babylonian science of the Chaldeans. So I guess that's the word's right there. So duh.
Yeah. Yes.
They were known for their astronomical observations and that sort of thing. So
Actually, it is in Monroe and in Bailey, the Babylonians. But the 1743 doesn't have the word Babylonian that I see.
Yeah, I think I was looking at one of the other translations. So I was surprised. I didn't realize that the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn were as old as what they are, evidently. But I was like, okay, I stand corrected. It is interesting to see the sun move along the horizon throughout the year. My personal experience of this is that I have an infrared sensor on my garage door. So at certain points of the year, the sun will hit it just right so it will not close in the morning. So I literally have to block the sensor with something to get the door to close in the morning. So it's at a particular, and it just happened just recently is what brought it to mind. But knowing that the sun is it's gonna move, throughout the days and the weeks, and then it'll go away, and then it's my connection to the astronomical phenomenon of the sun moving from one tropic to the other.
And I'm looking now at the Bailey version of that last sentence, and it's probably more clear than the 1743 when he says, as the Babylonian teaching of the Chaldeans denying the science of the astronomers. So what is he saying there? Is that an allusion to astrology versus astronomy, or is it just a different system?
That was my take.
I presume that it's a competing system, but they're both still largely superstitious based. Just as if what each of them fights for may not be the truth, or there were any cause why you should venture to adopt the one less than the other. So at least for today, we end on another reference to the being careful not to just take a partisan view of one over the other unless you've got the evidence to do so.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the theme of this particular section of Book 5.
Well, let's begin to think about closing thoughts for the day. Martin?
Yes, one more thing to add. So he clearly states that the sun travels underneath the earth. So this is then again indirect support that he wouldn't think of flat earth, because if you really think this is a three-dimensional picture is going underneath the earth, then it just plainly makes sense that the earth itself should be called ball-like as well.
Yeah.
Basically everything, earth, moon, sun, everything's a sphere. That's what it seems like.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, that was all what I still had to add for today.
Okay. Sorry we didn't have Charles with us today. We'll hopefully have him back next week. But Don, do you have any final thoughts for the day?
No. The only matter of trivia that I'll bring up is I had never heard of the goddess Matuta. So that was a new one on me.
That doesn't even sound like a Roman or a Greek name to me. Did you look it up to see?
I did look it up, and it's the same goddess as that we know sometimes as Aurora. So it's the goddess of the dawn, and that's also the goddess in Homer where he describes her as rosy-fingered. So that's where the whole rosy-fingered dawn comes from, and dawn with a capital D. And that's the whole idea of the rosy tinge across the horizon, and then where Lucretius talks about all that light coming together and forming the sun whenever it comes up in the morning, that you can see evidently from Mount Ida.
Yeah. I was about to make the ridiculous observation that Matuta sounds to me like a brand of an automobile, just like one of those guys had Ahura Mazda or something as a god over in Iran, right? So I think of Mazda and Matuta, but I just did a Google of Matuta. It says Matuta or Mater Matuta.
Right.
Tuta being a Latin word about taking care of something or something like that, tutelage or something. For some reason, I've gotten into that word occasionally.
The only thing that jumped out at me, first of all, was Hakuna Matuta. So it sounded like a Disney from The Lion King.
Okay.
Hakuna Matata is the one that's in the Lion King, but Matuta, it sounded like, it's like, oh, well, that sounds like that. Okay. It is not connected. So I will just say that out loud. It's not connected. So only in my loosely connected brain.
I mean, it's in the sound systems of some African languages, and Japanese are very similar. This could be as well an African language word or a Japanese word.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got whichever language, whichever the consonant vowel sort of syllable structure they have. Yep. So that is completely off topic. But,
a good way to end the day, probably. I don't even know what we're going to be into next week, but we'll see. Martin, were you saying something?
I mentioned, of course, it matches Latin as well because Latin has a similar sound system.
Yep.
Okay, well, with that, then we'll just agree to come back next week. So anybody have anything else?
That's it from me.
Okay, well, we'll come back in a week and do it again. Thanks, everybody, for your time today.
Yeah, thanks and bye. No?
Bye-bye.
Bye.